In 1911, the United States government did something it had never done before. It broke apart the most powerful company in the world. Not with an army, not with an election, with a single court ruling that tried to kill a monster that by then had already won. Because by 1911, Standard Oil didn't need to fight anymore. It controlled nearly 90% of the oil refined in America. It set the price of light in millions of homes. It decided which railroads survived and which ones starved. And almost no one outside a small circle of men in Cleveland and New York understood how it had actually happened. This is not just the story of a company. It's the story of a system, a hidden architecture of contracts, threats, secret payments, and quiet takeovers built by one of the most controlled, patient, and ruthless minds in the history of business. His name was John D. Rockefeller. And he didn't build an empire by being the biggest, or he built it by being the most invisible. Let's go back to where it started. Not with oil, with bookkeeping. Rockefeller wasn't a wildcatter. He never drilled a well in his life. As a young man in Cleveland, he worked as an assistant bookkeeper, and the thing that obsessed him wasn't adventure. It was control over numbers. He tracked every cent. He is said to have kept meticulous personal ledgers from his teenage years, recording every dollar earned and spent. That obsession with control would define everything that came after. In the 1860s, oil was chaos. Pennsylvania's oil fields had turned into a gold rush. Fortunes were made and lost in weeks. Wells ran dry without warning. Prices swung wildly, sometimes changing by the day. Hundreds of small refiners competed for the same crude, the same railroads, the same buyers. Rockefeller looked at this chaos and saw something almost nobody else did. He didn't see an oil business. He saw a refining bottleneck waiting to be owned. Because drilling was a gamble. But turning crude oil into kerosene people could actually buy. That was a business you could control with efficiency, scale, and leverage. And leverage was the word that would define the next 3 decades. In 1870, Rockefeller and his partners formed the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. At the time, it controlled roughly 10% of American refining. Within a few years, that number would look almost quaint. The tool he used first wasn't a monopoly. It was a railroad deal. In 1872, Rockefeller quietly joined a scheme called the South Improvement Company. The idea was simple and, in hindsight, almost breathtaking in its audacity. Standard Oil and a small group of allied refiners would guarantee railroads a massive, steady volume of oil shipments. In exchange, the railroads would give them secret rebates, discounted rates that were kept hidden from every other refiner in the country. But it went further than that. Every time a competitor shipped oil on those same railroads, Standard Oil received a kickback on that shipment too, a payment on oil it never even touched, simply because a rival had used the tracks. Imagine running a small refinery in Pennsylvania in 1872. You have no idea this deal exists. You just know that suddenly your shipping costs are climbing, your margins are vanishing, and Standard Oil's prices somehow keep beating yours. You assume you're a worse businessman. You have no way of knowing you're competing against a system rigged against you before you even light the furnace. When word of the South Improvement Scheme leaked out, the backlash was immediate and furious. Oil producers in Pennsylvania rioted. They boycotted the railroads involved. The scheme collapsed within weeks, and Rockefeller's name became, for the first time, a symbol of everything corrupt about the new industrial economy. Most people would have called that a defeat. Rockefeller called it a lesson. The lesson wasn't "don't rig the system." The lesson was "don't let them see you do it." What followed over the next several years is what historians now call the Cleveland Massacre, although no blood was spilled and almost no headlines were made. Between 1871 and 1874, Rockefeller systematically approached rival refiners in Cleveland one by one in private meetings. He would show them his cost figures, his efficiency numbers, his railroad rates so much better than theirs that competing against him was quite simply mathematically impossible. Then he would make an offer, sell to Standard Oil now, quietly, at a fair price, and either walk away wealthy or join his organization. Refuse, and watch your business get ground down until it was worth nothing at all. 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries sold to Rockefeller within 2 months. Not because he threatened them with violence. He threatened them with math they couldn't beat, created by advantages they couldn't see. This is the part of the story most people miss. Standard Oil's monopoly wasn't built primarily on public battles or dramatic price wars that made headlines. It was built in private rooms, refinery by refinery, through information asymmetry. Rockefeller knew exactly how much it cost him to refine a barrel of oil. He knew exactly what rebate he was getting from every railroad. His rivals didn't know any of it. They were negotiating blind against a man holding a map of the entire battlefield. By the mid-1870s, Standard Oil controlled the majority of American refining capacity, and almost nobody outside the company understood the true scale of what had happened, because Rockefeller had deliberately kept much of it hidden behind a web of separate corporate names and quiet stock arrangements. And this is where the story turns from ruthless business into something closer to legal engineering. Because by the 1880s, Rockefeller faced a new problem. Standard Oil now operated in dozens of states, but American law at the time made it extremely difficult for a company incorporated in one state to fully own and control companies in another. Corporations were legally treated almost like local citizens, boxed in by state borders. So Rockefeller and his lawyers invented something the world had never seen before. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust. On paper, it was almost boring. A legal arrangement where the stockholders of dozens of separate Standard Oil companies handed their shares over to a small group of 9 trustees. In exchange, they received trust certificates. Those 9 trustees now controlled the shares of every company in the empire, while each individual company still appeared on the surface to be independently owned and operated in its own state. It was, in effect, a hidden command structure disguised as a collection of unrelated businesses. To a regulator in Ohio, or a journalist in New York, or a rival oil man in Pennsylvania, the oil industry looked like it was made up of dozens of separate, competing companies. In reality, nearly all of them answered to the same 9 men, sitting in the same room, making the same decisions. This is the moment Standard Oil stopped being merely a powerful company and became something closer to an invisible government of American oil. The word trust would go on to define an entire era of American capitalism and an entire era of American law written specifically to fight back against it. But that fight was still years away. In the 1880s, almost no one had the legal language or the public awareness to even describe what Rockefeller had built. By the end of that decade, Standard Oil controlled somewhere around 90% of the oil refined in the United States. It didn't just sell kerosene. It effectively decided the price of light for an entire nation at a time when kerosene lamps still lit most American homes after dark. And here's the part that connects this story to something far bigger than oil. Rockefeller had discovered, almost by accident, a pattern that would repeat again and again across the history of business. Real control doesn't come from being the loudest player in the market. It comes from being the most informed, the most patient, and the most invisible. While competitors fought each other in public over prices, over headlines, over reputation, Rockefeller was quietly buying the railroads, the pipelines, the barrel manufacturers, and the very infrastructure his rivals depended on just to stay alive. He wasn't just winning the oil business. He was becoming the terrain the entire industry had to walk on. But invisibility has a limit. Eventually, systems this large leave traces. And in the 1880s and 90s, a small number of journalists, regulators, and one extraordinarily determined woman began pulling at the threads of the Standard Oil Trust, threads that would eventually unravel the entire structure Rockefeller had spent 30 years hiding in plain sight. Ida Tarbell grew up watching this system from the inside out. Her father was an oil producer in the Pennsylvania fields, one of the small operators who had watched helplessly as Standard Oil's hidden rebates and pipeline deals crushed independent refiners throughout the 1870s. She never forgot it. And decades later, as one of the only serious female investigative journalists in America, she got the assignment that would define her life. In 1902, McClure's magazine sent Tarbell to do what almost no one had managed before, actually document how Standard Oil worked. Not the rumors, not the outrage, the mechanics. She spent nearly 5 years on it. She tracked down old railroad rate sheets. She interviewed former Standard Oil employees. She got access to court records from obscure state lawsuits that had barely made headlines outside their own counties. Piece by piece, she reconstructed the very things Rockefeller had spent 30 years hiding. The secret rebates, the fake independent refiners that were actually Standard Oil in disguise, the 9 trustees quietly running an empire that looked from the outside like dozens of separate companies. Her series ran in McClure's from 1902 to 1904, and then as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company. It didn't read like an angry pamphlet. That was exactly what made it so devastating. It read like an audit. Cold, documented, almost clinical, which made the picture it painted even more damning than outrage ever could have. For the first time, the American public could see the machine, not just its effects. The government had actually been building a legal case in parallel. In 1890, Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law aimed squarely at exactly the kind of structure Rockefeller had invented, combinations that restrained trade and crushed competition. For over a decade, the law had mostly sat there, rarely enforced with real force. Tarbell's reporting gave regulators something they'd never had before, a public that finally understood what they were looking at and demanded something be done about it. In 1906, the U.S. government filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Act. The case ground through the courts for 5 years. And in 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict. Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and it had to be dissolved. Not fined, not restructured, broken apart. The ruling split Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. And this is where the story loops back into the present day in a way that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. The two later remerged as ExxonMobil, one of the largest companies on Earth. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco, later absorbed into BP. Standard Oil of Ohio became part of BP as well. Continental Oil became Conoco. The breakup didn't destroy Rockefeller's empire. In a strange twist that only became clear years later, it multiplied his fortune. He held stock in all 34 companies, and as independent entities, several of them became more efficient and more valuable than the single sprawling trust had ever been. Rockefeller's personal wealth actually surged after the breakup, at one point making him, by some estimates, the richest private citizen in modern history relative to the size of the entire American economy. The man who built his empire on being invisible ended his life as one of the most visible philanthropists in American history, funding universities, medical research, and public health initiatives that still bear his name today. Same discipline and long-term thinking that let him quietly outmaneuver an entire industry, he later poured into giving much of that fortune away. So what's the actual pattern hidden inside this story? It's not simply that Rockefeller was ruthless. Plenty of his competitors were ruthless too, and they lost. The pattern is about information and structure. Rockefeller won because he understood his own numbers better than anyone else understood theirs. He won because he built legal structures, the trust, that let him coordinate total control while appearing, on paper, to be dozens of separate, ordinary businesses. And he won because he was patient enough to build all of this quietly, refinery by refinery, contract by contract, years before the public or the government had the language to even describe what he was doing. It took one journalist 5 years of painstaking documentation to make an invisible system visible enough for the law to finally act on it. And that's the hidden pattern behind Standard Oil, and arguably behind every monopoly that's followed it since. The danger was never really the size of the company. It was the fact that for 30 years, almost nobody outside a handful of men could actually see how it worked. The system doesn't have to hide forever. It just has to stay hidden long enough. If you want to understand how the systems hiding in plain sight actually shape who wins and who loses in business, in politics, and in history, subscribe to Hidden Pattern. Because the biggest empires were never the ones you could see coming. They were the ones you couldn't see at all.